Well, thank you for being here. You know, one of the many ways in which members of the Edmonton community support Concordia Lutheran Seminary is by being present for events like this. If you're interested in the Bible, interested in Genesis and Ruth tonight, this is a place to be. I also know that many of you are supporters of the seminary financially, and I want to thank you for having done that and pray that you continue to look favorably upon the seminary and continue your support. And if you have never included us in your charitable giving, please consider doing that. So tonight, the first hour is actually probably going to be more like 40-45 minutes because the first topic is briefer than the second topic. The second topic, okay, the book of Genesis is 50 chapters long. You'd think that would be the long one, and Ruth, being only 4 chapters, would be the short one. But the truth is we're going to spend we're going to look at a bird's eye view of the book of Genesis, the structure of Genesis based on some of the content in the book as well as what the New Testament has to say about Genesis. And then we're going to look much more closely at the book of Ruth and actually read through the text of Ruth, which you can do. And I guess if you read nonstop, it takes about 20 minutes to do. So P.J. Wiseman wrote a book by this title at the bottom of the screen called Ancient Records and the Structure of Genesis, A Case for Literary Unity. A lot of Old Testament scholars think that the book of Genesis consists of 3 documents written by 3 anonymous people and spliced together by various editors who are also anonymous over the centuries. And Wiseman, first of all in 1936, and then a book that was reprinted in 1985, made the case that the book is unified, but maybe not in the way that you think it is. But before we get into this, how many of you have ever heard of Yogi Berra? Okay, I just looked him up. I got to give you some quotations from Yogi because he was famous for the kinds of things that he said. He was probably most famous for saying it ain't over until it's over, which is not funny, but kind of clever and very true. But I looked him up earlier tonight. He played 19 years in the major leagues. He was a catcher with the New York Yankees all those years except one. And he was named to the All-Star squad 18 out of the 19 years. That's pretty impressive. But he had a way with words. Maybe some of you know that, especially if you go back a few years in history. Reporter approaches Berra during spring training. Mr. Berra, good afternoon, Mr. Berra, you look mighty cool today. And Yogi says, thank you, ma'am, you don't look so hot yourself. Pretty clever, actually. When asked what time it was, Yogi asked, you mean now? Well, think about it, you'll get it. We lost because we made too many wrong mistakes. Okay, Yogi. I guess he got a little bit confused from time to time. It sort of reminds me of the time that he met Marilyn Monroe and she was talking about, you know, we ought to get married, we'd have kids with my looks and your athletic prowess. We could have really wonderful kids. And Yogi says, yeah, what if the kids get my looks and your brains? Then our kids would be in big trouble. But that's not on the screen. So let's move on. He also said brilliantly, if you can't imitate him, don't copy him. Okay. One more slide of Berra-isms, if that's a word. A nickel ain't worth a dime anymore. Probably a description of inflation. Maybe one of his better sayings. Why buy good luggage? You only use it when you travel. Yeah, okay, I guess, Yogi, that's the idea. He also said, I don't know if you knew that he said this one, it is déjà vu all over again. So I guess the French phrase déjà vu means something like all over again, or it's somewhat repetitive. He also said baseball is 90% mental, the other half is physical. It wasn't really good with mathematics, I think you could say. Now the next one I think is actually sensible. He says it was impossible to get a conversation going, everybody was talking too much. And the last one, I just looked this one up also when I found out about the years in baseball. This is a Yogi-ism. You better cut the pizza into 6 pieces because I'm not hungry enough to eat 8. Okay, Yogi, wow. Okay, having lightened the mood a little bit, let's get into P.J. Wiseman's basic idea from the book of Genesis, and we're going to talk about those account statements that we mentioned last week. So the idea is that there are current phrases, catchlines, colophons is the big word for it in Genesis. In this format, these are the family histories of, these are the generations of, the King James used to say. NIV says this is the account of. And Wiseman says that these are clues to the literary structure of Genesis and indicative of its origin and transmission. Now, I just put this one into the PowerPoint earlier today as I was reviewing this because I sort of wanted to place this in context. There's a lot of Old Testament scholarship out there that thinks that the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, much of the Old Testament was transmitted orally. New Testament scholars operate the same way, with suggesting there's a huge gap of time between the events that occurred and when they were written down. They were transmitted orally, and the implication is that therefore the stories changed a lot and you can't really count on them to be accurate history. So if any of you remember your elementary school days where the teacher started this, what's sometimes called the whisper game, and tells this first student a story who passes it on to the next student, and by the time it gets to the end of the class and the last person retells the story, it bears almost no resemblance to the original story. That's how a lot of people think that the Bible, the books of the Bible were handed down, especially the Old Testament. So they're invented or transmitted orally, and therefore the stories changed over the years, over the decades. I personally, for instance, when it comes to the Gospels, I think that all four Gospels were written before 70 AD, which is when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans and the temple knocked down. It makes sense that if the most significant, most devastating event in the first century had happened by the time that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote their Gospels, that would have been mentioned somewhere in those Gospels. And so I think they were written very soon after the events they describe, within a decade at least. So here is the outline of Genesis, and I've seen other outlines of the book of Genesis. One broad outline that's pretty good is Genesis 1 to 11, primeval history, Genesis 12 to 50, patriarchal history. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph being the patriarchs, especially the first three of those. But the term primeval history, that word primeval suggests that, yeah, we're really talking about material that is legendary or invented or imaginative and didn't really happen the way it reads, and I do not accept that thesis. But at any rate, this is the phrase. 11 times in the book of Genesis we have these sentences translated into the NIV English. The word account draws on the Hebrew word toledoth, which comes from the Hebrew word meaning to bear or give birth to. So hence the King James Version, the generations of the people, the children, the families that were generated by the patriarchs. So that's the NIV. This is the King James Version. The Amplified Version says this is the history of, not bad. Christian Standard Bible, records of. These are the records of. The Easy to Read Version, I didn't even know that was a translation till I worked on this, calls it the story of. So those are all pretty similar to one another and give you the basic idea. The Hebrew text, Masoretic text, uses the word toledoth, and I put it there in both English and Hebrew for you Hebrew scholars. And if you're having difficulty with that bolded word on the lower right-hand corner, it's Hebrew, so you have to read it right to left. Does that help a little bit? Maybe not. Okay, toledoth is simply a transliteration into English characters of the Hebrew word, which would be pronounced toledoth. So the noun, as I said, comes from a verb meaning to bear, to give birth, to beget. And so it's talking about family and family histories. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about three scholars fairly famous Old Testament scholars. I used to own commentaries by Gerhard von Rott, a German scholar, apparently a good scholar, but pretty far to the left of me at least. Thompson, in the Bible and History, wrote on one occasion, it may perhaps appear strange that so much of the Bible deals with the origin traditions of a people that never existed as such. So Thompson sees Genesis, the entire Pentateuch, as largely fictional or imaginary stories. Martin Noth is a German scholar. A lot of bad theology came out of Germany, and that's a lot of my ancestry. Oh, boy. At any rate, I'm part of the corrective, I think, to von Rott and Noth. But Martin Noth once said that in the Pentateuch, 5 books of Moses, there is probably no more than one sentence that is historically accurate representation of things that actually occurred. One sentence. So you see how far removed from sort of a what you see is what you get approach to the scriptures. This last bullet in this slide may be total nonsense. You may never have heard of the documentary hypothesis, but this is the theory that the Pentateuch was not written by Moses at all, that the J stands for a document that liked to use the name Yahweh for God. Yahweh in German starts with a J, and it originated out of, guess what country? Germany. E stands for the Hebrew word Elohim, which is sort of a generic word for God, and is actually related to the Arabic Allah, which is a generic word for God too. D stands for Deuteronomy. In this theory, the book of Deuteronomy stands by itself, and these 4 letters indicate the sequence in which they think these documents were written, and the P stands for priest or priestly document. Everything that has to do with Leviticus and lists and names of priests and sacrificial functions and the like. And so J wrote somewhere around 950, and E wrote in about 850, they think. They can't prove it. J and E were combined in about 750, and then Deuteronomy was written about 621 BC, which is probably, well, it's the year that Deuteronomy was rediscovered after having been lost for a time, and then P writing about 550, and then 500 or so, the 4 got put together to form the JEDP theory. The truth of the matter is that except for Deuteronomy, which of course is a special case, J, E, and P do not exist anywhere except in the minds of the scholars that have proposed these theories. Don't believe it. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit to the origin of writing. Long ago, before we knew what we know today, critics, liberal scholars, assumed that writing only came in vogue in the Davidic period, 1000 BC. They missed that by at least 2,000 years. So writing originating around 3300 BC instead of 1000 BC. So, for example, Schultz wrote about the legendary character of the pre-Mosaic narratives. The time of which they treat is a sufficient proof it was a time prior to all knowledge of writing. Of course, this is 1893, before archaeologists did their work and discovered some very ancient documents, including documents that contain most of the Pentateuch. The Dead Sea Scrolls hadn't been discovered by that time, and so this was commonly thought in those days. So therefore, Moses, if Moses lived around 1400 BC, couldn't have written Genesis through Deuteronomy because writing hadn't been invented yet. Well, that theory was destroyed as people did more study and did more archaeological work. So P.J. Wiseman, the author of this book about ancient records and the structure of Genesis, says the book of Genesis was originally written on tablets in the ancient script of the time, clay tablets. I'll show you a picture of one later. You've probably seen them before. By the patriarchs who are intimately concerned with the events related and whose names are clearly stated in Genesis. Moreover, Moses, the compiler and editor of the book, as we now have it, plainly directs attention to the source of his information. Well, I don't know how plain it is, But Wiseman thinks, and I agree, that Moses is the author of those 11 statements. This is the account of. Those are his ways of splicing together two independently written documents and putting them in chronological order. So that was his thread to link different narratives together that make up the book of Genesis. So archaeological work in Babylonia was part of this whole picture. They used to do work in Babylonia in the 1800s. Claudius James Rich, Paul Botta did some excavating, discovered the Syrian palace of Sargon II in Nineveh. So Sargon's mentioned in Isaiah. Austin Henry Layard began doing some excavation and discovered the black obelisk of Shalmaneser, which mentions Jehu, son of Omri. If I'd have thought about this a while ago, I could have brought a picture of the black obelisk. It's located in the British Museum in London. And I have a picture, several pictures of that obelisk that shows Jehu on his knees bowing down before an Assyrian king. And it's this king and this Jehu, because there's an inscription connected with it. So they're discovering things that authenticate, maybe not authenticate, but document many of the events of Scripture. Hormuzd Rassam excavated a mound at a place whose name I can't pronounce, at Nineveh, finding the palace of Ashurbanipal, and tens of thousands of tablets, including a creation story and a flood story from the Babylonian literature. Did you know that the Babylonians had a flood story and a creation story? Yeah. George Smith, more discoveries. I'll come to Alexander Heidel in a bit. In 1888, the U.S. began to be involved. Dawn of the 20th century, the Code of Hammurabi, which some people think is the origin of Moses' 10 Commandments. I think they got it backwards. It's the other way around. But the Code of Hammurabi was discovered and gave us codified some laws that were probably already in existence in Abraham's days. Sir Leonard Woolley began excavating Ur of the Chaldees and found what he called evidence of the biblical flood, which is probably every bit of evidence for a biblical flood has been challenged by scholars who don't really think that the Bible is accurate or true. So here is a book called The Babylonian Genesis by Alexander Heidel, who happens to have been a Missouri Synod Lutheran, our sister denomination to the south of the U.S.-Canadian border. And he basically destroyed the idea that Moses' writings were based upon the Babylonian flood story and creation story and are a variation on that and an attempt to improve on it. Again, they got it backwards. So these Babylonian tablets that contain a creation story, you can read it today in English. It's been translated and it shows up in a huge book. I think I still have it in my library. Maybe not. Maybe I got rid of it as I downsized my library. It's this big and this wide, and it's that thick. I mean, it's got all kinds of pictures and texts, and actually 2 companion volumes. And you can read the Enuma Elish, which is the name of the Babylonian creation story, where the gods are, let's say, less lofty and noble than the God of the Bible. So you got multiple deities. It's a polytheistic account. And you've got the Babylonian deities that are fussing and fighting with one another and not getting along, and hardly the idea of a deity that would be worthy of our worship. So the Babylonian tablets, I think, are a corrupted form of the Genesis record instead of the other way around. Because of the high state of culture long before Abraham, much of Genesis was probably written on tablets like the hundreds of thousands now discovered. And keep in mind that Darwinian evolution thinks that we are gradually evolving, gradually improving. People are smarter today than they ever were. And I actually think it's the reverse. We're not as smart. We don't have as good of memories as people used to have, because there's scientific evidence that the human genome is suffering from harmful mutations generation after generation. So probably the smartest person ever to live was Adam, the first human being, totally uncorrupted mind, body, DNA, and with the fall into sin, corruption began to kick in. And I can't prove this, but my theory is that the 12 disciples were picked by Jesus in part because they had the ability to remember the things that Jesus taught and could memorize off the lips of Jesus the exact words that he said in the way that he said them. And I've heard a couple of stories about people who had vast memories, and other cultures that don't have much of a literature or maybe don't even have a language that's written down have amazing memories, what people are able to learn. If you've ever been to a theater and seen Hamlet performed on a stage, I bet you, well, maybe not, but you probably marveled at the memory of the person who played Hamlet, these long passages that he had to memorize and recite. But Billy Graham once was on the Johnny Carson show and told Johnny in that conversation that he once met a man who had the entire New Testament memorized in 2 languages. Gives you a little bit, and this is 20th century stuff, so I think that the farther back you go, the better people's minds were able to retain things. At any rate, that's a theory, but I'm moving through this faster than I thought. I'm over halfway done. So I said when we started, if a couple of you missed that this will probably be 40, 45 minutes. We'll take an early break, a longer break, and then we'll spend more of the evening on the Book of Ruth than we will. Ruth is a great name, don't you think, Mrs. Strand? Just objectively speaking, you'll pick somebody randomly out of the audience and she agrees with me. Okay, very good. We have a daughter whose middle name is Ruth, by the way. I guess I could say that. But I digress. That's for the second half of this evening. So here is the picture of a cuneiform writing on a clay tablet. Scripture and archaeology give evidence that the narratives and genealogies of Genesis were originally written on stone or clay tablets and in the ancient script of the time. This is before the invention of the alphabet. However, there's I don't remember the name anymore, but just a memory comes back to me of a Canadian scholar from Ontario. Can any good thing come out of Ontario? Yeah, I think so. Who has made the case that there's a fair chance that the alphabetic script originated with Moses, because the time at which you move from hieroglyphics or cuneiform symbols like this to an alphabetic script like the Hebrew language is somewhere around 1400 BC when Moses lived. So anyway, intriguing theory, very difficult to prove something, because if you're talking about documented evidence from 3,400 years ago, there's not going to be a lot out there. But anyway, that's an intriguing theory. Whether it's true or not, I can't say with certainty. So let me share a few more things. This is all from Wiseman's book, by the way, or almost all of it. So this is from Wiseman's book for sure. The words Moses said appears in the New Testament only when citing Exodus through Deuteronomy, never when citing Genesis. Wonder why that's the case? It may be because Moses wrote Exodus through Deuteronomy and he did not write Genesis, and that's part of the evidence or the argument behind Wiseman's theory that those account statements, these are the accounts of our Moses editorial insertion tying together previously independent documents. The account statements conclude a section of Genesis and point back to the preceding material, probably inserted by Moses to indicate the owner and or author of that material. Maybe just the author of that line that binds 2 sections of Scripture in Genesis together. So back to that fancy word, the colophon. This is a conclusion to a tablet, which usually contains the name of the scribe. This is a way, catch lines are a method of preserving, I'll illustrate it in the next slide, a way of preserving proper sequence of 2 or more tablets by repeating some words from the end of the previous tablet, or better, repeating at the end of each subsequent tablet the first words of that tablet as follows, like bookends. So Genesis 1:1, the first section, when God created the heavens and the earth. Then Genesis 2:4, the Lord God made the heavens and the earth. So almost like bookends for that first creation record. And then later on in chapter 2, verse 4, when they were created. The end of that section, chapter 5, verse 2, when they were created. Is it a coincidence that almost the identical words appeared at the beginning and the end of a literary unit? Likewise, the names Shem, Ham, and Japheth in 6:10 and 10:1, after the flood in 10:32 and 11:10, and so on. Abraham, Deor, and Haran, Abraham's son, mentioned in both sections of this unit, who is Edom, one of the sons of Jacob, who doesn't play a major role in Genesis, and then the father of the Edomites. So these would be sort of like bookends to different sections of the book of Genesis. A couple other points from Wiseman. There are Babylonian words that appear in chapters 1 to 11. In fact, in part of my research in my doctoral dissertation, I found an Egyptian loanword appearing in Genesis 49, which happens to be, I wrote my dissertation on the last blessing, the last words or last testament of Jacob just before he died, which shows some remarkable similarities to the last words of Moses just before he died. So Jacob blessed his 12 sons in Genesis 49. Moses blessed the 12 tribes in Deuteronomy 33, second last chapter of Deuteronomy, second last chapter of Genesis, and there's some parallels between those two accounts. And I found, so the Joseph story is Genesis 37 to 50, and we'll look at that story in some greater detail next week. Spend the whole evening on Genesis 37 to 50. But in that section where Joseph ends up being sold into slavery in Egypt, and then the entire family comes to Egypt, and would it make sense that Jacob and his family pick up a few Egyptian words while they are living there, and that Jacob maybe used a word or two of Egyptian in his blessing of the 12 sons before he died? Possibly. That makes sense to me. Anyway, Babylonian words appearing in chapters 1 to 11. Egyptian words in chapters 37 to 50. Chapter 1 uses archaic expressions before names had been given to the sun and the moon. I think these are indications of the great age of the sun and the moon. A little bit of that I talked about in the very first lecture last week. That Genesis should still contain archaic expressions and show traces of the literary aids associated with the use of clay tablets is a witness to the fidelity with which the text has been handed down to us. Now, Wiseman thinks Moses wrote Genesis 37 to 50. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe he did. But this is one of the rather remarkable statements from, this isn't quoted word for word, but this is me paraphrasing what Wiseman wrote. So in no instance is it an event recorded that the person or persons named in the account statements could not have written from intimate personal knowledge or from contemporary information. So for instance, if the flood story was not invented, is it an actual historical account, we have a couple of options. Number one, God dictated the account word for word to some scribe, to Moses or someone else. Or if somebody wrote the account of the flood by having lived through the flood we have narrowed down the possible number of human authors to 8 people, right? Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their spouses. That's 8 people. And who would be the most likely person to have written that? Well, any one of those is a possibility, but Noah would carry the most responsibility for making sure that the story was recorded and conveyed, and that the tablets that he maybe wrote the flood story on were preserved and passed on to the next generation. We don't have accounts in Genesis or the Pentateuch that say that Noah wrote it and then he took care, he carefully preserved the tablets and then he gave them to Abraham, who gave them to Isaac, who gave them to Jacob. But at least if you divide each literary unit with those 11 account statements, and then you read each section, you'll notice that there is at least one person named in there who would have known, or would have lived through all of the events that are described there. And this isn't part of my PowerPoint, but I do remember reading a Scottish Presbyterian scholar by the name of Richard Bauckham, who wrote a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Tremendous book, in my opinion, a bit difficult and deep, but he argues, and I think this is accurate and very, very defensible position, that in the 1st century A.D., history that was good history was considered to be written by people who lived through the events they describe. Our idea of history today is, somebody studies some of the writings of some obscure writer, let's say, maybe C.S. Lewis in the first half of the 20th century, and reads accounts of other people that knew him and then ends up writing a life of Lewis or a part of Lewis's life and puts that in a book and writes the book, sells the book, and that sort of a thing. We do history like that. We have a colleague of yours, Dr. Strand, who just published a book on Reformation history called Becoming Lutheran, where he describes how the Reformation played out in the southern German city of Braunschweig. And he's going to be talking about that Monday across the street. Which way? That way. Yeah. In a lecture in the main academic building at 4 o'clock, 3rd floor. I've got a poster upstairs in case anybody's interested in that. But he wrote history about 500 years ago, about events that occurred in one city in Germany to help us better understand how the Reformation took shape. We sort of read Lives of Luther and we get this broad picture, that like the 30,000-foot view from the airplane that's flying above the surface, just sort of like this is a bit of a 30,000-foot view of the book of Genesis. But that's how we think of history today for the most part. But in Jesus' day, anybody know who was the greatest Jewish historian of the 1st century? Josephus. And did he write history about 200, 300, 500 years prior to his? No, he wrote 1st century A.D. history. And that, even in the time of Herodotus, good history was considered to be history written by people who had lived through these events and therefore recorded those events accurately. So in each of these sections, marked off by the Toledoth sections, the catchwords that mark the beginning and the end of each section, could have been written by someone within that unit. And it may be that Wiseman says Moses wrote Genesis 37 to 50 because Jacob, chapter 50 contains the account of Joseph's death. I don't think Joseph wrote that. Just likewise, Deuteronomy 34, the last chapter of Deuteronomy, contains the account of Moses' death, not likely written by Moses, although I suppose it could have been theoretically, somewhat miraculously. But Jacob didn't live through all that time, and Joseph didn't live through all of that time, and there are some things that Joseph knew that Jacob didn't, and vice versa. So maybe he's right, and maybe Moses did some editorial work to pull together previously written accounts of those events. So, anyway, I think that's a powerful statement that supports the idea that each section of Genesis between the 11 statements this is the account of was written by somebody, could have easily been written by somebody who knew all of those events from personal knowledge or contemporary information, Wiseman says. So, who wrote the original tablets? The history recorded in the sections written over the names of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, ceases in all instances on the date on which the tablet is stated to have been written or before the death of that person. That, by the way, is an icon from one of the Orthodox churches of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that image on the left. There is no statement in Scripture to support the idea that the narratives of genealogies were handed down orally, as some contend. On the contrary, they claim to have been written down. Many references are made to towns which had either ceased to exist or whose original names are so ancient that the compiler had to insert the names by which they were known in his day. So, for instance, Genesis 28:19, reference to Bethel and Luz. Interesting little footnote here for the reader. He, Jacob, called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Okay, why is that there? Because they are ancient records that a place that later on came to be known as Bethel. And likewise, chapter 35, verse 6. Jacob and all the people with him came to Luz, that is Bethel, in the land of Canaan. There he built an altar, etc., etc. So kind of a footnote that somebody inserts to indicate the reliability of this ancient tradition, what the name of that location used to be. These new names and explanations fit in exactly with the circumstances of the people then on the edge of the land of Canaan about to enter it, thus suggesting that Moses used earlier records and that he was the compiler of the book. Now you'll note that this is not a hard and fast case. A lot of it's circumstantial, and Wiseman is piecing together things like the fact that Moses said is never used in the New Testament to refer to Genesis. So what's the implication of that? And he draws an implication. It's said about Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but not Genesis. And he's drawing a conclusion about these sort of footnotes that the author or compiler inserts the name, an updated name. One archaeologist makes the case that the city of Ramses, mentioned in Exodus, I think it's chapter 1, verse 11, the author, which would be Moses, is using the name that was contemporary with the time that he lived and worked, and that the original name of the city was not Ramses, but he's using a name that would be familiar to the readers of that book. Last slide. New Testament writers base important arguments and illustrations on the narratives of Genesis, which would be useless and misleading if based upon legend. The testimony of Jesus and others, I agree with Wiseman, verifies the historicity of Genesis. And so he's making a case for the literary unity of the book based upon those catchphrases, those threads of account statements that tie together those apparently independently written documents that contain the names of people who lived during those events, and therefore the names of people who are better choices for having written those sections of Genesis than an unnamed editor like J, E, or P, or even Moses for that matter. So I'll stop here and invite a little bit of Q&A if you want to talk about some of this, because we are ready to take a break. And we'll do that early, like I said earlier. Yes, Kobe.
You mentioned that the Babylonians have a flood story. It's also interesting because almost all early cultures that we've ever interacted with, like through history, have a flood story, have an account of the flood.
From what I heard, there are something like over 300 flood legends or accounts in hundreds of cultures? Why do they all have a record, even if it's somewhat different from the biblical story, when we're relying upon human fallibility to record that? Yeah, you can see where there'd be some variation over the centuries, but that, I think, is testimony to the fact that there was an original flood that actually occurred, and all of those flood stories would be derivations from the actual historical flood story. I think there's a book, somebody wrote a book, I don't have it, never bought it or saw it, but I think somebody compiled those dozens and dozens of flood traditions and listed the peoples that they originate from and the nature of the flood story. And there's usually a boat and flood story would probably have a boat, right? And one key figure who was the hero of the story, and the rough outlines of the flood story from the book of Genesis. Yeah, thank you. Anybody else? Yeah.
I'm wondering, is the idea of this theory that Moses would have translated these accounts into using an alphabet?
Yeah.
Or that he wrote in cuneiform and somewhere along the line it got translated, or
Yeah, well, he would have had the motivation. You know, God told him to write some things down for the benefit of the people because he's not going to be with them forever. So he had an incentive, kind of as a founding father of Israel, plus at the direction of God, to record some things. Given the fact that both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Babylonian cuneiform has hundreds of symbols, that provides a motivation for a more concise way of recording stories. And Moses was probably a brilliant individual. How could you come up with an alphabet? Where to get the idea from? I don't know. We're not told anywhere. But to have a system of sounds as opposed to a picture for almost everything under the sun that we can imagine would create this alphabetic script and make it possible to write the Pentateuch in, how many hundreds of pages, as opposed to a room that would probably be filled with books. A room this size would have to have hundreds, maybe thousands of books to tell all the stories with those individual hieroglyphics and pictograms. And the cuneiform writing is used with a stylus. There's one implement that you can press into the clay in different ways, and then different configurations, kind of like if you were to learn Chinese or Japanese or Korean growing up in one of those cultures today, how many symbols do you have to learn in order to be able to be fluent in reading and writing Chinese, for instance? I mean, it's hundreds, to be sure. So anyway, yeah, that's part of what is behind the idea that, can we say with any certainty that Moses invented the alphabetic script? No, but
at some point, if this theory is true, there was a translation.
yes, and I'm guessing that the Middle East, where Israel or Canaan is located, has Egyptian language. You got Syrian language, Assyrian, Babylonian. You've got a culture that's a little bit like some European cultures, where a country like Liechtenstein is right next door to Switzerland and near France and Italy, and so a lot of young people grow up speaking 3, 4, 5 languages because they are in this multicultural, international culture with a lot of commerce and trade and travel between countries, and so it's not unusual for a European to grow up knowing 3, 4, 5 languages. I know one, and that's the only one I'm fluent in. And I've studied Greek and Hebrew and a little bit of Latin, a little bit of Arabic, but I know nothing about cuneiform. But yeah, that problem of living in a culture where there's really only one language spoken is the difficulty of picking up other languages, especially later in life. Yeah. Okay, any other comments or questions? Because I think we've largely exhausted this topic, but yeah, Tim.
So just trying to get it in my head, the Torah statements
Yes.
are they come at the end of each story?
Yeah, there's been a bit of debate in scholarship whether they are at the end of each story, at the beginning of a story, or they serve that double purpose. And I know it's politically advantageous to say both and rather than either or, but that seems to be the case. That, and if in fact Moses has two historical records, one following after the other, it would make sense to tie them together, that Toledo statement would serve both as a conclusion to the preceding one and an introduction to the next one. Okay?
And, I was thinking about New Testament, the New Testament writers. Matthew was a tax collector.
Yes. Educated person.
Why couldn't he have written, the Sermon on the Mount right away?
Wrote it down, yeah. Yeah. I told somebody, maybe it was last week, but about a missionary story I heard that I'm pretty sure is true, where a native African who didn't speak English heard an English speaker deliver a sermon in an African village. And the missionary came back the following Sunday, and this native repeated the missionary's sermon to him word for word from memory. Well, we catch glimpses of that when we hear stories of people who have photographic memories. Our friend Samuel from India is like that. He's got kind of a photographic memory. I had a seminary classmate who attended Michigan State University, and one of his classmates could take a book. It probably wouldn't have been a hymnal, but just imagine this is a novel, and he could read the book as fast as he could turn the pages. And you could give him a 200-page book, he'd page through it in half an hour or however long it took him to turn the pages. And then you could ask him, okay, what is the 15th word on page 184? And he could tell you. But he flunked out of Michigan State University. And I'm not, anybody ever heard the name John Fromm? That's the seminary classmate of mine. You might have heard that name. He was a colleague of mine at Concordia University, Texas for a while, and a communication prof and a pastor. But he's the one that told that story. And the reason why the guy flunked out of Michigan State University was because while he had perfect recall of facts, he could look at, say a page of historical dates for the history of whatever country, France, let's say, and he could reproduce what happened on such and such a year, or when did the Bastille fall, and he could give the exact date and the characters. But if you asked him an essay question so integrate what you learned from this area to that area and write a 200-page essay combining those elements plus your own personal testimony, he was totally lost, and he just could not answer an essay question, and that led to his demise. So be careful what you wish for. I sometimes wished I could have a perfect memory like that, and then I'm thinking, well, maybe it wouldn't be so great. But anyway, let's take a break, and we'll come back in 10, 15 minutes, and we can take a little bit more longer time, and we'll get into the Book of Ruth, one of Mrs. Strand's favorite books, I hear. Once again, thank you for coming. Welcome back. Thank you for supporting the seminary, both by your gifts and by your attendance at an event such as this, or watching this online tonight, or in the future. I know some people from Calgary that are going to be using these Quest lectures for a Bible study group, so greetings to them as well. I think they know who they are, just as I do. So let's actually begin this second section with a prayer, and as we probably should have for the first session of the evening as well. Lord, we do thank you for your word that makes us wise unto salvation through faith in Jesus Christ, and we thank you for the way in which you set up the message of the gospel with so many ways of preparing your Old Testament people to pave the way for the coming of the Messiah. Now inspire us and encourage us in the study of your word, enable us to grow in grace and in knowledge of him who gave his all for us, even Jesus Christ. Amen. So the broad theme of the book of Ruth is from emptiness to fullness. We'll illustrate that later on. In fact, towards the end of this PowerPoint, I'm going to ask you to think about how it is that emptiness is the experience of Naomi in the early part of the book, and how it is later on changed to fullness, but we'll come back to that later. But I brought along a picture of Ruth, so I thought I'd share this with you also online. So there is Ruth, quite the babe, don't you think? So let's get into a little bit of the geography, and we're going to do some reading of the text, maybe read through the entire book this evening. So this is a map I drew years ago to illustrate the various cities of the conquest that are identified in the 12th chapter of Joshua. And it was just a way I could illustrate also the geography of the book of Ruth. So the action begins and ends in Bethlehem, which is kind of a famous town in Christian history, right? Bethlehem, for those of you that maybe don't already know it, well, whether you know it or not, it's true. It's 6 miles southwest of Jerusalem. Whether you knew that before or not, it didn't change its location because you happen to know it. And we probably know one of the most famous messianic prophecies from Micah chapter 5, but you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are little among the clans of Judah, out of you will come a ruler whose origins are from of old. So Micah is predicting the birthplace of the Messiah, and when the wise men come to Jerusalem looking for this Messiah whose star has paved the way for them, they come to Jerusalem and ask about this, and the Jewish leaders cite Micah as Bethlehem as the location, so they head to Bethlehem. You know that story too. So here's Bethlehem, just west of the Dead Sea, and you can, if you've got good, really, really good eyes, you can see Jerusalem barely. That's what you get for sitting in the back. But, oh well, take my word for it. The blue star is Bethlehem. And Moab plays into this because, of course, where Ruth, or not Ruth, but where Naomi and Elimelech go during a famine in Judah is to Moab. And that's where we meet Ruth and Orpah. So let's just talk a little bit about the book of Ruth before we look at some of the opening verses. The purpose of the book of Ruth, according to Dictionary of the Old Testament, an article by D.I. Block, a professor at Wheaton College years ago, says that the purpose is to honor David by remembering the noble characters in his family history. My reading of the book of Ruth is that the purpose is to show the providence of God as he works his plan out in the life of Ruth and Naomi and that entire family line, because Ruth ends up being one of the ancestresses of Jesus. And I define providence as the non-miraculous working of God. I mean, what gets all the attention in Scripture but the miracles, especially in the life of Jesus, but 99% of the time or better, God works providentially without performing miracles. And he works in our lives to guide us to maybe be a student here at the seminary, or come and attend this lecture, or adopt the job, take the job that we have, meet the people that we've met in all kinds of ways. That there's no miracle involved in that, but God is guiding us as we trust in him to guide. But no miracles going on there. So God most often operates through the ordinary circumstances in which we live. We can see his hand in our lives as we look back on our past. God's name is mentioned 20 times in this book. So he's prominent, but he's still in the background. 4 chapters, 20 mentions of the name of God. So here is an outline of the book. Some artwork that's probably rather famous. I don't happen to have in my notes who painted that, but these are some women gleaning in the wheat field of some landowner. We start out with an Israelite family in Moab. Because of the famine, Naomi and Elimelech moved to Moab with their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They return to Judah after the famine is over. Chapter 2 is the story of Ruth the gleaner. Chapter 3 and most of chapter 4 is the marriage that is prepared for and arranged between Ruth and Boaz. And then the book ends with kind of a postscript, a genealogy. And so we start with the date and the era in which the book was, the events of the book took place in the days when the judges ruled. I date that roughly 1400 BC to 1100 BC, or 1050. So around 1100 BC, towards the end of the book, towards the end of the era of the judges. And here's a question for you, audience participation at this point. What is the last word in the book of Ruth? The very last word. If you were to open your Bible to the book of Ruth and go to the last chapter, the last verse of the last chapter, you would find anybody looking it up to see what is the last word. I mean, we love to have the last word in a conversation or an argument, right? Especially an argument. Last word is David. Okay. I said, what does that tell us about the book's message? Well, you could speculate about it. It does tell you that at the time this book was written, or at least at the time that this genealogy is attached to the end of the book, David is significant. He is known. Otherwise, why do you put his name in there? Why do you tell his ancestry? So David has risen to some sort of prominence. He may be king of Israel at this time, or it may actually be after David, but that's the last word in the book of Ruth. And so, you know, the most important parts of a sermon are the introduction and the conclusion. Because those are the parts that you pay most attention to. So how do you handle that middle part of the message? Tough thing to keep a person's attention for 10, 15, 20 minutes of talking, but that opening story illustration and then the finale, really important parts of any given message. So this says something, and you could probably come up with as good an explanation of that as I do, or I would. But it does also tell us it's written about the era of the judges, but it's completed at some point in David's life or shortly thereafter, when he's arrived at a certain point of prominence. So let's take a look at the first chapter of the book of Ruth. Just follow along. I'm reading out of the NIV from 1984, that first NIV version, not the more recent one. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab, hence the geography I showed you earlier. The man's name was Elimelech, whose name means actually, my God is king, kind of a spiritual or a godly sort of name. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. So, but you Bethlehem, Ephrathah is a region within which Bethlehem was located. There's also Bethlehem in northern Israel in the territory of Zebulun. So naming them as Ephrathites would distinguish this Bethlehem from that northern Bethlehem. The word Bethlehem means house of bread. What's the irony? Yeah, that's kind of an anticipation of what Jesus will say, I am the bread of life. But why is it that they have to move to Moab?
No
Yeah, because of a famine. They don't have any bread, even while they're living in the house of bread. Well, it wasn't a gingerbread house. It wasn't a house made of bread, but nevertheless a town, a village whose name means house of bread is lacking bread, lacking food, and so they leave for another country. So the nature of the crisis, verses 3 to 5, follow along. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So here she is, a widow. She's got 2 daughters-in-law who are Moabites and not necessarily inclined to join her when she returns to Judah, but we will see how that happens. So let's start reading through the response to the crisis, because the crisis does come to an end, the famine does end. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people, your family, even though you are not Moabite." But Naomi said, oh no, that's through verse 10. Let's read on to verse 11 in just a moment. So what does the desire of Ruth and Orpah, not Oprah, but Orpah, to go with Naomi suggest about the relationship? Fairly obvious, yeah. Close relationship. They love her. Would be hard to part from them. And so what's going to follow is a reflection of the so-called Levirate law that is described in more detail in Deuteronomy 25, even though it's not, the layout of that rule isn't so clear, even in Deuteronomy. But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands?" So the nearest male relative would be raised up to marry the widow, especially if the man who died had no offspring. And so the first child born to that new union would belong to the name of the dead, the deceased husband, and that way the family line would be carried on. And besides, she's saying, you're going to be 20 years older than your future husband. You want to wait that long? It doesn't make sense, she says. "Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband, even if I thought there was still hope for me. Even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." So the way I summarize it is nearest male relative, because it would be a brother. Brother would be obviously the closest male relative, but the nearest male relative who is still single. It could be a cousin, could be somebody else a little bit more distant, but that family connection is supposed to be the obligation of this unmarried male to marry the widow so that his deceased brother or male relative could have his family line carrying on. Let's read on from starting at verse 14. "At this they went again. Then Orpah kissed her mother. They wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. 'Look,' said Naomi, 'your sister-in-law is going back to her people, and her gods go back with her.' But Ruth replied, 'Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God.'" This is a commentary on verse 16. New American Commentary. The first words we hear from Ruth's lips alone are among the most memorable in all Scripture. Few utterances in the Bible match her speech for sheer poetic beauty and the extraordinary courage and spirituality it expresses. And of course, we know where those words are often read, right? Frequently at weddings. even though it's a daughter-in-law speaking to a mother-in-law. Verse 17. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. Notice that Ruth is using the word Lord, and some of you know this, that whenever the word Lord appears in the English Bible in all caps, that is the way in which the translators reflect the fact that this is the name Yahweh. This is the personal name of God, the covenant name of God, the name by which he is called when his love and grace towards his people is indicated. So it sounds to me like Ruth is a believer in the God of Israel. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. And I kind of think she wanted to have some companionship when she returned to Bethlehem. So let's take a look at verses 19 to 21 as we near the end of chapter 1. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" Of course, she's been gone for 10 years. It was a small town, no surprise. Maybe Naomi and Elimelech were prominent people. Maybe it's just the fact that it's a small enough town where everybody knows everybody else. But anyway, they're stirred. Can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Naomi is a Hebrew word that means pleasant. Call me Mara, which is a Hebrew word meaning bitter, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. Now here is a key verse for this overarching theme of from emptiness to fullness. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me empty, brought me back empty. So fullness to emptiness to fullness. The downward slide is pretty well done by this point. So the rest of the story is moving from the emptiness to the fullness by the end of the book of Ruth. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So they've been through a lot, and here is the literary theme of the book of Ruth. So notice that Naomi has 4 complaints of God. Anybody ever complained to God about the hand of cards you've been dealt? Health problems, relationship problems, financial problems, you name it. So these are the 4. I read that in a commentary, 4 complaints, and so I had to look in the text. 4, really? So a bitter life, an empty life, an afflicted life, and misfortune. A lot of overlap between those 4 complaints against God, but she hasn't seen the gift that she has in her daughter-in-law. Well, she has, but she's not appreciating that daughter-in-law very well at this point. And so her situation is a lot like that many people experience today. I mean, all of us, I suppose, at one point or another. But the story of Naomi is a reminder that one can maintain a godly perspective or lose it entirely and then come back to it as God sees us through those difficult times. He doesn't promise to protect us from the difficulties, but he does promise to be with us in the difficult times. So now we shift gears to a new setting. Last verse of chapter 1. So Naomi returned from Moab accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So how is Ruth described? Verse 22.
As the Moabite?
As a Moabite, yeah. Daughter-in-law also, but the main idea is Moabite. Let's look at that passage again and 5 other passages. How is Ruth described in chapter 2, verse 2, 2:6, 2:21, 4:5, and 4:10? You don't have to look very far. You get to about the third one in chapter 2, verse 6, and you see maybe a common theme. Every time she is a Moabitess or Moabite, and in all 6 of these passages, she is identified as the Moabitess. In other words, she's not one of us, she's a foreigner. Kind of like during our years in Texas, we still get asked the question, having lived in Texas for 25 years, so where are you from? In other words, okay, you might live here, but you're really not one of us. You don't talk. You don't have that southern drawl I can't even put it on like some people can make up southern accents and British accents and all kinds of accents, but you don't sound like one of us. But, okay, this foreigner is one of 4 women included in the genealogy of Jesus according to Matthew's Gospel. And a couple of these are rather questionable characters. Tamar, who slept with her father-in-law, Rahab, the prostitute of Jericho, Ruth, a foreigner, Bathsheba, the wife of King David. Why are those 4 women mentioned there, but not Rachel, Leah, Rebecca, and Sarah, all of whom were part of the genealogy of Jesus? Interesting portfolio for Jesus' ancestry, and it gives us a bit of a clue why Ruth's described as a Moabitess these 6 times. Romans 2, it's worth looking up this passage. You can look it up with me if you like, which is a good reminder and encouragement to us too. A man is not a Jew if he is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. So we are children of God by faith, not by genealogy, not by ancestry, not by accomplishment, not by skin color or ethnicity, but by faith, which is available to anybody and everybody. Pretty cool, I think. By the way, I just learned this recently. And Cheryl, you can't answer this question because I know you know the answer. Who are the first people to notice Jesus' miracle at the wedding in Cana?
Servants.
The servants. Not the high and mighty. Who are the first people to hear the announcement of the birth of Jesus? The shepherds. Wow, it's like God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. He elevates those who are, blessed are the poor in spirit, doesn't he say in Sermon on the Mount? Anyway, God is a God of grace, and in a certain sense, every one of us who is a child of God by faith in Jesus Christ has been humbled and then elevated, it seems to me. Okay, so we're just going to read through chapter 2. Just follow along, and I'll read through it relatively quickly. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, if there's any piece of humor in the book of Ruth, it's this phrase right here. As it turned out, just by coincidence? I don't think so. The providence of God. God is working non-miraculously. This wasn't an accident. She found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you," they called back. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, "Whose young woman is that?" Or he might have said, "Whose young woman is that?" I don't know. We're not told with what expression he asked that question. Whose young woman is that? I'm not so sure. The foreman replied, he knew that she was a foreigner. She's not someone he'd seen before, so it sort of makes sense. The foreman replied, she is a Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Gleaning, of course, is that practice that you pick up the stalks of wheat or barley or whatever the crop is after the harvesters have gone through, and they are not supposed to glean every last stalk. They're supposed to leave some food behind for the poor who can work for a living and pick up something for the dinner table. So let's see. She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? I mean, she knows she's not one of them. Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. I want you to note that word wings. We're going to come back to that a little bit later in the story. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, separated the heads of grain from the stalks, and it amounted to about an ephah, 3/5 of a bushel, according to my footnote. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Then Ruth said to her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working, the name of the man I worked with today is Boaz, she said. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is a close relative of ours. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. Then Ruth the Moabitess said, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all the grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Chapter 3. So we're going to look at Naomi's plan, Ruth at the threshing floor, and then Ruth's return home. So first of all, Naomi's plan. One day Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for? Moffat says, I must see you settled in life. The NIV says, I'll need to find a home for you, which the Hebrew is really saying, find rest. A rhetorical question, I guess you could say, why do we so easily attribute good things that happen to us to coincidence or our own great skill instead of an answer to prayer? Okay, that's rhetorical. Don't answer that question. Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been, a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. So threshing is beating the stalks to cause the wheat and the chaff to separate. Winnowing, also mentioned in verse 2, is tossing the pile in the air on top of a hill, usually where there's a strong wind. The wind blows the chaff, which is light, away, and the heavier heads of grain fall straight down, so you generally separate the wheat and the chaff. Verse 3, wash yourself. Okay, here's actually a picture of threshing, beating the grain, and this is winnowing, tossing the grain up in the air with the wind glowing. Here's, oops, went the wrong way. Chapter 3, verses 6 to 13. So let's see, verse 4, when he lies down, note the place where he's lying, and go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he might have had something alcoholic there. He went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, probably the temperature drops, gets cooler. Something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. D.B. MacDonald is going to say about Boaz being shown quietly handling the situation like a gentleman, and not either as an old fool or as a village lout. He may be countrified, but he has dignity and restraint, as we see the rest of this section play out. But she also is appealing to his relationship to the Naomi Elimelech family and mentions Boaz's kinsman obligation. So, in verse 8, Ruth probably had to wait a while to make certain that Boaz was asleep. Boaz expected to be alone, so he was startled, or he may have shivered. The uncovering of the feet get cold, he wakes up, and then he sees her. Now verse 9. I am your servant Ruth, she said, spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer. Remember I said to note the word wings in chapter 2, verse 12? The word corner in chapter 3, verse 9 is the same Hebrew word as the word wings in chapter 2, verse 12. So the corner of, say, a suit coat almost looks like a bird's wing if you use a little bit of imagination. Same Hebrew word is pronounced kanaf. And it's as though the author is suggesting to us that the wings of Yahweh that provide refuge for Ruth are actually the corner of the garment of Boaz, who is going to care for her and provide for her in the future. I'm your servant Ruth, she said, spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer. Commentary states, the reader stands back in awe, wondering what has possessed her. Here is a servant demanding that the boss marry her. There's some other ancient Israelite culture that's reflected here. A Moabite making the demand of an Israelite, a woman making the demand of a man, a poor person making the demand of a rich man. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied, verse 10. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor, and now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am near of kin, there is a kinsman redeemer nearer than I. So nearest male relative, he's second closest, but this other guy is closer. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem, good, let him redeem. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. Well, we have a legend in North American comic book history. Have you ever heard of Sadie Hawkins Day? I guess that's one day of the year which she gets to chase after him. And okay, maybe not a close correlation, but this is God working providentially through the provision that Boaz is going to make for Ruth. It's going to include marriage. So she is at the threshing floor. The word kindness in chapter 3, verse 10 is the same word as in chapter 1, verse 8, reflection of care and concern. Ruth, according to verse 10, could have married someone younger, much younger than he. He compliments her, which is the mark of a leader. And we can see other instances of leadership, both in Ruth's part and Boaz's part in this story. Especially, I think, the way in which Boaz takes charge of the situation. He's interested in the hand of Ruth in marriage, but he's also going to follow the law because there is someone who is a male relative that's closer in the family line than he is. Just a word about Noble character. You are a woman of noble character, verse 11. Do you know where else that phrase appears in the Bible? Two other places. Both of them in the book of Proverbs. 12:4 isn't all that familiar to us, but Proverbs 31:10, a woman of noble character, who can find? So those are the only three places in all Scripture where this phrase occurs. Is it possible that when Solomon wrote that last chapter of Proverbs, that he had Ruth in mind, whom he was describing in that chapter? So pretend you are Ruth, and the words of verses 10 and 11 are spoken of you. Kindness that you have shown, I'll do for you all you ask. Everyone knows you're a woman of noble character. I think anybody would feel pretty important or loved or appreciated to have words like that spoken of her. How do we know that he's eager to pursue this? Well, he says so, right? I will do for you all you ask. And the rest of the story shows that he acts very promptly, very quickly. As quick as Abraham was to obey God and go to Mount Moriah to sacrifice his son, so also Boaz is quick. He takes the bull by the horns and moves quickly on this arrangement. This is a rhetorical question. How much sleep did those three get that night? I mean, I'm guessing not a whole lot. Certainly a lot of excitement on the part of Ruth and Boaz. Maybe Naomi kind of knows what's going on too. She's sort of arranging this. She knows what could happen, so she may well be spending a largely sleepless night, anxious to hear how it goes when Ruth returns in the morning. Stay here for the night, verse 12. In the morning, if he wants to redeem good, let him redeem. We read that. So how much confidence would you have that Boaz would follow through on what he promises here? Let's go to the next section of chapter 3. So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized, and he said, don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. Verse 14, I think we know why Boaz didn't want the event to be publicized. The word said may actually mean said to himself, because there's no hint that any of his men were present, but we don't really know. We're speculating here. Verse 15, he also said, bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out. When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then he went back to town. So depending on how you measure this, Morris's commentary says 88 pounds, or twice what she had gleaned in one previous day. Others say 18 to 30 pounds. At any rate, she must have been a strong woman to be able to carry that kind of weight back home to her mother-in-law. And he goes into the city to address the situation immediately. Verse 16, when Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, how did it go, my daughter? I got a feeling she said, tell me everything, details. Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Then Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. So she kind of knew Boaz's character, maybe from having lived in Bethlehem previously, maybe what she had heard, maybe the fact that he's a landowner, he's a devout man, he uses the name of the Lord piously, but somehow she knew. The word empty in verse 16 is used as in chapter 1, verse 21. Her empty days are over, and she is going to be filled with plenty of barley when Ruth gets back home. So the man is probably a deferential term. Wait means sit tight. because it's out of your control now. Maybe a good time to pray. Chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. Naomi and Ruth are very proactive and take steps, but now it's in someone else's hands, which is sometimes a difficult thing to do, to leave important negotiations for someone else to follow through on. You'd like to be there and remind him, don't forget to say this, and get your tie on kind of straight, and make sure you're looking good. We'd love to give him advice, but he steps up to the plate. So, Ruth chapter 4, the rescue of the royal line. We're going to have two scenes. First of all, the legal resolution, verses 1 to 12. Secondly, the genealogical resolution, and then an epilogue, which contains the genealogy of the royal line. So this is the legal resolution in chapter 4, verses 1 to 12. I don't know if you can imagine this a little bit, but where does Boaz go according to chapter 4, verse 1? He goes to the town gate. Anybody know why he goes there?
Because everyone's going to walk into the town.
True, and that's probably one of the reasons why it became a prominent location. It's also the place where all legal transactions take place in the presence of other witnesses. So there is a formal action that's taking place here, formal and legal action. Remember when Absalom won the hearts of Israel away from his father David? Where did he spend a lot of his time? By the city gate. Again, it's practical because that's where people come. Some people live in the town overnight. In some cases, it's a walled city. I don't know if Bethlehem was walled, but a small town. But that's not only where you meet a lot of people, but it's also become customarily the place where legal transactions take place, where a lot of people were located. So let's take a look at verses 1 and 2. Boaz gets ready. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat there. When the kinsman redeemer he had mentioned came along, Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Probably a formal action that was necessary in order for this proceeding to be considered legal. Verses 3 to 8 are a transcript of the court proceedings. Then he said to the kinsman redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so, but if you will not, tell me, so I will know, for no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. Has anybody noticed the name of the kinsman redeemer, the guy that's closer in relationship to Naomi than Boaz is? I haven't either, because he's not mentioned. Why? Because the author has concluded it's really not important for us to know the name of this guy. He doesn't play in the story except being somewhat of an irrelevant detail, and we're told the names of the people that are really important for us to know. Verse 5, Boaz kind of says, "Oh, by the way," one little complication. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabitess," there's the 5th time she's described as a Moabitess, "you acquire the dead man's widow in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the kinsman redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." So we're not told how it would endanger his estate. We're just told that it would, and he says he's unable to do so. Verse 7, parenthetical. "Now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel," suggesting that this is an ancient story that's being told later on at the time of David, perhaps, or even later than that, because in David's day, they might not have known about this custom. So Boaz's response, verses 9 and 10. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, and I think this is a formal statement that's necessary in this legal transaction. Today you are witnesses that I bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess. There's the 6th time she's mentioned as a woman from Moab. Mahlon's widow as my wife. First time we know which of the 2 named sons Ruth married. Not that we need to know, because it's another irrelevant detail. In order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from the town records. Today you are witnesses. And they, in a formulaic response, then the elders and all those at the gate said, we are witnesses. So they affirm what he is saying and agree with him. So the reaction is public, lots of witnesses, not just the 10 elders. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. Those 2 women, wives of Jacob, not that Genesis authorizes bigamy. Plus there were the 2 handmaidens, so that family produced 12 sons. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. So back up a little bit. Boaz acts immediately, as Naomi predicted. She knew Boaz. She knew him as a man of nobility, just like Ruth is a woman of noble character. Is the arrival of the kinsman coincidental? Probably not. I'm guessing that he came into the town every day at that time, and Boaz knew his actions. Small town, everybody knows everybody. 10 elders constituted a legal assembly. One of the reasons why Paul went down to the river in Philippi and met Lydia there was because there were not 10 men in Philippi capable of starting a synagogue, which you had to have in order to begin a synagogue. And so he went to a public place and met Lydia there. Philippi happens to have been very much of a Roman town where a lot of military people from the Roman armies retired. And it was a very Gentile community, so there wouldn't have been a lot of Jewish people. And if you read the book of Philippians, looking for quotations from the Old Testament, like you'll find in Romans that Paul wrote to a Jewish community at Rome, or some of his other epistles, you will look far and wide for Old Testament quotations that would resonate with a Jewish audience, because Philippians was written largely to Gentiles. And so, I digress a little bit. Not many Jews in Philippi, needed 10 for a synagogue. 10 elders constituted a legal assembly. Verse 3, the proceedings, Boaz addresses the sale of the land. It's got to stay in the family. Boaz is next in line, would redeem it, wants to know. Naomi may have had no real rights to the land. Don't know, it says may. So verse 4. Thought I should bring the matter to your attention. One wonders, where is Ruth at this time? Is she watching? I'm guessing yes. What do you think? She has a vested interest in what happens there, but she'd at least be curious and want to know. And who is it that wrote this book anyway? Verse 5. Boaz says, and oh, by the way, you can have the land, but you get the lady too. And so the Levirate law applies here as it would have applied back in chapter 1 when Naomi's 2 sons had died a decade after her husband did. It is not clear how the acquisition of the land would endanger the kinsman's estate. A couple of guesses the commentators offer: financial reasons, cash flow, the estate staying in Elimelech's family, so after he dies the land reverts to Elimelech's family anyway, not sure. Somehow we are able to find a picture of the actual taking off of the sandal to make sure that everything was legal. And Boaz's response then in verses 9 and 10, where he completes the legalities of this transaction in the witness of these 10 elders and probably a lot more. So how does Boaz's closing speech begin and end? This is one of the reasons why I say it's formulaic. It's a legal proceeding. A little bit of an echo of the first hour tonight with those catchwords. He starts with the words, "Today you are witnesses," and he ends with the words, "Today you are witnesses." Like these are indications that this is the start of the statement and this is now the conclusion of the statement. Did you know, I mentioned Richard Bauckham's book on the Gospels. Did you know that in the first century, they didn't have footnotes. The authors didn't sign their names. I mean, Paul puts his name at the beginning of his epistles. But commonly, the way in which an author indicated the primary source of the information in that book is to mention the primary source as the first person named in that book and the last person named. So you end up with these bookends. And if you look at the four Gospels, you find some interesting things about, and I'm just remembering that fact. I'm not remembering whom Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John mentioned first and last. The secondary witness is mentioned second and second last. And the Gospels fit that pattern so that the authors are indicating, and I think this is one of the reasons why Mark is considered Peter's Gospel, because Peter is prominently named in either the first or the second position. Anyway, that's sort of a way of reflecting that this legal proceeding is now complete in Boaz's speech. So he didn't actually buy the property because it wasn't Naomi's to sell. He redeemed it or acquired it but did not purchase it. The issue, the rights to acquire the produce of the land and the Levirate law, the priority of the family unit in ancient Israel so that the family doesn't get destitute. If the land is sold or acquired, it does revert back to the original family owners prior to that time. This is sort of a question for modern application. Do children belong to the family or to the state? In some societies today, you can find people that will argue that children really belong to the state. And the biblical perspective, of course, is that they belong to the family. I said this earlier, so let's look at the reaction, the public reaction to the outcome of the court proceedings in verses 11 and 12. Then the elders and all those at the gate said, "We are witnesses." We read this already. So they accept their role, probably the rules of the proceedings. They break out in a formulaic three-part blessing. May the Lord make the woman. May you have standing in Ephrathah. May your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Have you ever wondered why there? Well, you probably never wondered because you didn't know there was a three-part blessing at the end of this section, but it sounds a little bit Trinitarian to me, doesn't it? Rachel, then Leah. Judah, where Bethlehem is located, was born to Leah. They want Ruth to be as fertile as Leah was. Mention of Perez, Tamar, and Judah enforces the idea that this is an instance of the Levirate marriage, which is described in more detail in the story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38. So we got Perez, or Perez, I guess would be the Hispanic way of saying it, is the ancestor of Boaz's clan and the Bethlehemites in general. So the genealogical resolution, verses 13 to 17. Ruth has moved from the status of blank to blank to blank to blank. Chapter 2, verse 10, she's foreigner. Chapter 2, verse 13, she is the lowest servant. Chapter 3, verse 9, she is a maidservant. And finally, at the end of the story, she is wife. This verse in chapter 1, verse 6 are the only two places where God is the subject of a verb. So God is active here. Let's see, which verse? Yeah, the Lord enabled her to conceive, verse 13. So let's look at that section and maybe I think you can answer this question, so what? So Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. Then he went to her and the Lord enabled her to conceive and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," technically grandson, but she's the nanny. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Again, commentary states that ultimately the royal line is preserved because 2 pious human beings and Yahweh act in consort for the achievement of his purpose, but it's through the ordinary passage of time and events. We've got a blessing, a prayer, and a declaration of confidence. The child is the solution to Naomi's insecurity. In verse 14, the verse literally says, "May his name be called in Israel," that is, may it be kept alive or famous after his life is over. The message is one of new hope late in life. And the word love, where is that word? Is covenant commitment. Who loves you, verse 15, and is better to you than 7 sons. That's Ruth's love for Naomi. Okay, well, let's just go on to the end of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. Verse 16, picture of a doting grandmother. Took the child, laid him in her lap, cared for him. 3 different things describing that. And then the redundancy points to a climax. Obed probably is short for Obadiah. I found on the internet that there's a certain bicycle brand named Obed. I don't know where that comes from. Probably not this story, probably not the book of Obadiah, but nevertheless, that is the case. There we got an artist representation of Ruth and Naomi and baby Obed. So, said this is about movement from emptiness to fullness. So tell me what losses appear in the opening chapter.
We lost a family for Naomi.
Okay, husband and 2 sons have died. What else?
Famine.
Okay, lack of food, sustenance. Anything else?
They lost their home.
Yeah, their home, their homeland. So some significant losses. How does God replace those losses with blessings? Well, the famine is over. The family is restored. They come back to Bethlehem and Judah. And so here is a guy by the name of D.F. Robber wrote an article in a Journal of Biblical Literature years ago called Literary Values in the Bible, the Book of Ruth. So on the left-hand side, we've got emptiness, that word emptiness written there. On the right-hand side, fullness. We go from famine to harvest. We go from isolation to community. We go from barrenness to fertility. She's not going to get married again, Naomi, have more kids. Levirate law isn't going to apply here, so it looks pretty hopeless. From old age to youth. I mean, Naomi continues to age like we all do, but now this child is born, and from hopelessness to hope. Hence, the phrase that appears earlier in one of the verses that we looked at is that from emptiness to fullness. It's talked about in the midst of the book of Ruth, and that takes us to the end of the story. The genealogy of the royal line, 10 generations, some of which may be omitted, although I read once that this could be a complete genealogy here. So Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Aminadab, Aminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. The last word in the book of Ruth. And Obed marks the convergence, one commentator says, of piety and providence. End of the story. And I think this graphic kind of pictures it well. Original marriage, some of the genealogical work. We have a king named David, and we've got the King of Kings named Jesus, who is directly descended from David and from Jesse, Obed, and Ruth and Boaz. Pretty cool story. Comments or questions? Our time is up. Yes?
Any significance that in verse 17, the women of the neighborhood gave him the name?
Well, the best thing to do in answer to a question you don't know the answer to is to say, I don't know. It certainly reflects the much stronger community aspect of life in ancient Israel and in much of the world today compared to North America, where we tend to be much more individualized. But the women living there said Naomi has a son. It's the collective. There's community there. Social bonds are strong, which is why Naomi was welcomed back so well when at the end of chapter 1 they returned to Bethlehem. Other comments or questions? All right. Well, we are done with the Book of Ruth, done this evening. Let's close with a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you that you work providentially in our lives, even as you did in Ruth's life. Maybe not in some significant ways, maybe not to end up producing one of the ancestresses or the ancestors of Jesus, but nevertheless, we follow in Jesus' train, partly because people like Ruth and Boaz took their responsibility seriously to live as people of God within a covenant community. We thank you for their lives, for their example, and for the way in which you have provided for them and us through your grace and your providential care. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.